Hi, I'm Billy. I'm an alcoholic, and I apologize for being late. It's good to see everyone back here again. What's amazing is why I am late. I am late because I got called into a meeting to deal with a drunk employee who did something inappropriate at an event that I had some responsibility for, and you know where that goes. Blah, 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 blah. We all know we can follow that path. What's amazing is that I always say, not at work and not at professional settings, but in these circles, that my job has sent me to some really what's called fancy, high-end, whatever you want to call it, team building, unity building, all those fancy code words they have inside the business world. And I can tell you that without a doubt, the two biggest tools that I use in my professional life are the 12 traditions and the 12 concepts for world service. There's not a problem I run into in my professional capacity where I cannot rely on the traditions or the concepts where I can't find help in either of them. It's really amazing when you look at those 24 principles plus the 12 equaling the 36, but I always joke around, I'm always one to be on a soapbox at one time or another, and I'm always willing to admit that. But I'm always on a soapbox about people who write books inside AA, the better book than the ones we already have. And I always say, but if I ever was going to be a hypocrite, I would write using the 12 concepts and 12 traditions in one's work life. Because for me, those 24 principles will keep you centered. I mean, I can give you two examples of that. One is tonight. I mean, I signed something for my company saying that if certain behavior was brought to my attention in management, that I would take the appropriate steps that are deemed the appropriate in today's world. Well, that doesn't mean being one of the good old boys like I like to live. That doesn't mean being like the person who people pleases because that person who did that is in my inner circle, whether they are or not. I've made some commitments at work, and these traditions and these concepts, I don't think I told the story of my secretary last week, did I? And I want to tell that because people say, well, how can you say you can use the 12 concepts in your daily life? I've heard that. And now the 12 concepts are right by our traditions in the back of our big book, and I can tell you that last year, and I'm pointing a finger at myself, I had a very good relationship with my secretary. Excellent. Until all of a sudden I noticed it was in the toilet, and I didn't really know why. But it was clear that our harmonious relationship was gone. And I didn't know why, but it was making my life difficult. And I finally realized about 2 months later that we had this big trip to Vegas, and we put on this training for a bunch of people, and we always call her our right-hand person, and she's part of the team, and I didn't bring her. I didn't invite her. And she felt left out. And about 2 months later, I was reading through the concepts, and I saw the right of participation and how important it is that if you don't let someone participate, how can they feel part of? And, I went to my boss, and I said, you know what, I made a big mistake last year. I didn't let her come. I'd like to put the money or take it out of my budget. You know what, when I went to her and told her that a couple of weeks later and said, listen, next year when we go away, you're going to come with us. You're part of the team. Our relationship was right back on track. And that has nothing to do with any fancy business school or management retreat up in the mountains. Right out of our service manual. And I want to cover a couple things. I think we had some great questions last week and some lively interaction, and that'll be encouraged again this week. The three things I want to go back over from last week so I can remember what I thought was important was, one is, to me, still the exit sign is the most important slogan as far as overall group unity. That when I walk under that sign, however a vote went inside my home group or my inner group or my general service area, that when I leave that room and I walk underneath that sign, my job is to carry out the group conscience. Not to gather 8 of my sponsees in Denny's and plan how we can change that decision. I say that because I've done that. So I'm pointing the finger right back at myself. I know perfectly how to walk under that exit sign and have my cell phone ringing or dialing and gathering up all the troops and saying, I can't believe this happened, but we're going to stop this. But that's not what the 12 and 12 in the service manual tell me. They tell me that when I walk underneath that sign, I'm supposed to carry out the wishes of the group conscience. And that's hard for a person like me who maybe ego and arrogance get in the way of not getting my way. Because that's what it's all about for me usually. And the other thing is the hard way to do things. I think I mentioned that last week, is that if you are an AA home group or an AA service committee or an AA in a group or a general service area, if you operate your conduct by the traditions, it will not be the easier, softer way. The traditions were not meant to be the quick way to get something done. Sometimes they feel like roadblocks. Other times they feel like you go in reverse instead of going forward. And I've learned that the reason they're not easy is because we as an organization have a bad habit of making rash decisions that bring us lots of pain. And so I think the traditions are really great that way. And the last thing is protecting us from ourselves. I mean, last week, pretty much all the traditions that we talked about, because I don't want to say I talked about, that we talked about, were all about how to protect AA and us from ourselves, not from anything else. I mean, I often sometimes laugh to myself because I think to myself, when I'm worried about someone outside AA breaking a tradition, but the fact of the matter is the traditions aren't for the outside world. They're for us. If you're not in AA, you can't break a tradition. We break the traditions. That's why it's so much harder for us to, set our conduct by these. And I'm going to go into Tradition 6. We'll do the same thing again as last week. If you have a question, raise your hand. I think they have a microphone this week they're going to bring to you so that it goes on the tape. Tradition 6 is up here. An AA group never endorsed, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. I mean, money, property, and prestige are probably a lot of the things that got a lot of us in trouble, the reason we sit in these rooms to begin with. I mean, those three things are things that alcoholics battle with. I can only comment on either my own inventory or other inventories I've seen, but a lot of them focus on that. And if you read Tradition 6 and 12 and 12, or you read AA Comes of Age, I'm going to just talk about a couple of things, and that is there's not a lot of AA clubs around here. Maybe we come into a couple that maybe fit the bill. But if you read AA history, AA was never supposed to run its own clubhouses for a lot of reasons. If you are an AA club and you have AA meetings there, the AA group is very separate from the AA club. In fact, there's a set of guidelines for AA clubs that GSO publishes that encourage clubs to be separately incorporated so that the club and the business are separate from the spiritual entity of the AA groups. But I want to talk more about practical matters where I've either messed up or I've seen things happen in AA. And I think one of the biggest things we run into AA is co-sponsored events. When you see a sign maybe hanging up that maybe looks like the church is not the place where the AA meeting is held. It almost looks like the church is sponsoring an AA event. And I think those are places where we have to be very careful, because I'm a person who's very grateful for churches. I know they're not part of AA, but I also know that they have a big role in renting space to AA groups to meet, very low priced. And I'm often very careful about, and I'll get to that later in the traditions, about how I talk about churches in an AA meeting. I'm very grateful that a church like this doesn't have someone outside asking us before we come in if we believe in their God. And the only way you can go to an AA meeting here is if you believe in that God. I've never ran into that since I've been in AA. In fact, I got sober, and I just saw someone walk in who got sober where I got sober, and recovering Catholic used to be a big thing I used to hear a lot in New York City, and, everything was that problem. And, until I heard someone say, have you ever been to a meeting in a Catholic church where a priest was outside asking you to make sure you believed in their God in order to go to an AA meeting there? That finally registered with me, that That has no place in an AA meeting. You know, that I'm going to be thankful, and I've seen some flyers in my experience, maybe some people have, where it's hard to tell. I've seen AA car washes. I'm not sure how you actually know which people are in AA and which people aren't, you know. That goes right into the seventh tradition. I mean, do you check before you take money from them if they're in AA? But I've seen lots of AA/other things. And I think I want to talk about that slash, or that hyphen, or that parentheses. I'm often in a lot of AA meetings where I'll hear something like this: are there any AA-related announcements? Well, that sounds easy. AA-related announcements, and I'll hear something like this: there's a recovery fishing trip. Well, is a recovery fishing trip an AA announcement? If its primary purpose is different from ours, it's not bad. I'm not saying it's not okay. I'm just saying when there's a hyphen or a slash and it says AA/NA, I mean, I've seen groups try to have meetings listed in meeting directories that say AA/NA, and what's interesting about that is if you were to write a letter to AA World Service or to NA World Service, they would both tell you that's impossible. Because if there's another primary purpose, it can't be an AA group. I mean, the requirement is 2 or 3 alcoholics gathered for the purpose of staying sober. And so I think in practical terms, it's things like that to watch out for. Now, I want to warn you. If you walk up to the person who makes the fishing trip announcement and say that's not an AA-related announcement, you will not be popular. So that's just, I want to throw that out there. It doesn't make you the popular person in your meeting. But I hear lots of things like that, and I think, you know, we have to be careful. And I'm pointing the finger back at myself, not being the AA police. I mean, I talked about that last week. Bill Wilson was emphatic that a group's right to be wrong was more dear than his right to be right, or anybody else's right to be right. But I can talk about myself. I've probably printed a few flyers in my day that, you could maybe do a little better job at. I also want to talk just a tad bit about literature, because the tradition does say, lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise. And outside enterprises are non-AA conference-approved literature. That doesn't make them bad, but if it's not approved by the General Service Conference of AA, it's not AA literature. And my practical experience is that my responsibility is to the newcomer. Not somebody like myself or someone else who's been around, but to the newcomer. And what I ask myself and other people is, no matter how good a non-AA book may sell on your literature table at your meeting, does it belong with the AA literature? I don't even want to get into the debate that you shouldn't sell it there, because your group's right to be wrong or anything else is more important than my opinion. I do feel very strongly, though, for newcomers, that our AA literature should be clearly marked and separate from non-AA literature. I've seen 4-step guides written by every company in the country. But if you're a newcomer, it's like a newcomer walking in and seeing me up here. If you'd never been AA before, you would think that I'm speaking for AA. Well, if a newcomer's walking over to a table, they should be able to know that certain books are AA books. I'm not saying the other books aren't useful or helpful or on my personal nightstand, but that's a big difference. And so when we talk about outside enterprises, we have to be very careful. I once was getting in an elevator in Chicago in a supermarket I shopped in, and as I was coming down, there were thank yous all around. What it was is the top of the elevator said, "Thank yous we've received for food we've donated." And so I'm just standing in the elevator, and by the time I got to the parking lot, I see Alcoholics Anonymous. I'm like, boy, that's very weird. So the service geek in me said, I should check into that a little bit, I'm going to make it my mission. Which I'm not saying that's right either. But what I found out is a local AA clubhouse had decided to accept money in the form of donated food. And, if there's one thing I care about when I get to the next tradition I'm going to talk about, it is our principles have been away for a long time. We take care of ourselves. If they wanted to say the Lincoln Park Alano Club, well, that's fine. That's not AA. The Lincoln Park Alano Club can take donated food. They don't operate by the same spiritual 12 principles that an AA group does. But when it says Alcoholics Anonymous, it's a big difference. Any questions about Tradition 6? Because some of the other traditions I know are going to cause trouble tonight because they just are. They're troublesome traditions, and I think that's what's good about them. They encourage healthy AA debate. Yes?
So when someone has like a special meeting and they're inviting a speaker coming in from around the world, and then they say a dance to follow, is that's slash? Like, is that?
Well, you see, I think slash is more of, when I look at it, so I'm not saying it's right or wrong. For me, slash means, besides the greatest guitarist for the Guns N' Roses, besides that, it means when another fellowship could possibly be tied in with AA. It means like AA/ACOA, or AA/SA/GA, Christmas Recovery Dance. A dance to follow, it's funny because I've been involved in young people's service for a long time, and I hear old-timers complain about dancing, but I have dancing flyers going back to 1947 because I've done a little research. So fellowship events related to AA are much different than changing the primary purpose. Now, if your group decides you don't want it on, I know a lot of young people's groups won't have a dance unless there's an AA meeting first to make it an AA event with something afterwards. And they don't charge for the meeting, and the dance is separate from the meeting. So that would be my answer there. Any other questions? Yes?
I'll just hold the microphone for the whole
Okay.
meeting. So if you go into a hospital, where they have a slot for AA meetings, and then they have a format for your AA meeting, is that still an AA meeting, or is that the hospital dictating about what the AA meeting is?
Well, I'm going to use a little bit of corrections experience with that. My gut and my experience passed down from people long before me is that when you're going to start a meeting in a facility like that, it's just as important for you to ask questions as for them. In fact, I have a checklist at home if you ever, let's just say a warden calls me up and says, I want to have a meeting. Well, I've been taught to go and meet with that warden and let him hear him tell me or her tell me what she wants. And then I take down all that information and I give no answers right there. And I take it back to my committee or whoever else and I talk about what they want. And what I do is I go back and meet with them again and tell them what I can give them inside the AA parameters. I can say, I can do this because that's what AA is. If you don't want this, well, you don't want AA. And my belief, with correctional facilities especially, is that if you give them a watered-down version of AA, you're depriving them of the AA that we love. And if they don't want our AA, they just want something else, and that's okay, but it's not AA. And I've been taught that eventually, my experience, I had to do that once at the Cook County Women's Facility. I went with the Corrections Women's Chair. I happened to be the delegate at the time from Chicago. They didn't want an AA meeting. They wanted some kind of hodgepodge of a million different fellowships. And we had to tell them, we can't do that. That's not what we do. A year later, they came back to us and finally said, we want an AA meeting. And out of that grew an AA meeting, a night they set aside where people could go in and take people through the work individually in rooms. So that's what grew out of that. So I think sometimes short term, you might get a bad answer. Long term, just like anyone who walks in here and decides they don't want to get sober, when they really need AA, they'll come and take advantage of all of it, not just picking and choosing. So my gut answer to that is there's a great guidelines, the treatment facility workbook that the General Service Office produces. You can call them up and have it sent to you, and you will see in there where the line stops of what AA is and what AA isn't. And more importantly, if we get down further in traditions, it always says we ought to always cooperate, not criticize. And I believe very strongly in that. My job in an AA meeting is not to criticize rehab or criticize therapy. But I will firmly say it's okay for me to know where that line ends. If I don't get involved with your 28 days when the person is there, then if someone comes to my meeting and says they don't have to do this because their counselor said so-and-so, well, then I'm probably going to take a little bit of offense and say, well, this is AA, that wasn't AA. So, but I would really suggest you get the Treatment Facilities Guidebook. It's very useful. Yes, Mike. Yes, Mike, you need the mic.
Thanks, Billy. There's been a Catholic Mass of Gratitude for the AA program in Chester for the last 22 years. It's the first Saturday in January at noon if you'd like to come. But the point is that the question I have is that the Chester group has announced that Mass of Gratitude in our secretarial announcements, from Thanksgiving forward every year for 22 years. Are we violating the traditions, or do you think we have the right under tradition 4 to be autonomous?
So do I want to add 40 more people on the line to hate me, or do I want, by answering that question? I say this. The Mass has nothing to do with the group. Whether that church is a church of any religion, if they want to be grateful for AA, there happens to be a lot of religions that are very grateful for AA. So I don't think the event is per se. I think it's more, I'll put it to you this way. What about if your group wanted to have a Catholic Mass? Would you want to announce that? Would you think it was inside the traditions? My gut tells me no. That you would say it's not a good idea for the Chester group to have a group trip to the Catholic Church as a group event. That's what my gut tells me.
So it's okay. You think it's okay for us to announce
No.
Mass?
My personal feeling is it sounds. My rule that's been told to me is if it sounds borderline, stay safe. So I always go with that rule. But your group could feel completely different to me. The point I'm trying to make is I think your group could ask itself, would we sponsor a group Mass for us all to go at the same time every week as members of this group? And I don't think your group would do that.
No.
So I think you have to ask the same question about that event. So but you guys could feel entirely different. I'm going to move on to the 7th tradition, which to me is not talked about enough. I think there's some very interesting things. I could tell the whole John D. Rockefeller story. A lot of us have heard it a million times about why we don't take outside money. But I think what's really important to realize, I was flying somewhere not too long ago, and I sat next to somebody who was a very distinguished retired person, and at that time was on the board of Physicians Without Boundaries, I think it's called. It's the organization that sends like 100 doctors to some place like Afghanistan. And obviously a very worthwhile charity that does a lot of good work. And we started talking about nonprofit involvement. And I have some AA experience and non-AA experience there. And he found it fascinating that AA took no outside money. Because I'll tell you this, if you go into the outside world, they're really, if you ask the average person, they'd be convinced we take outside money. I mean, there's a lot of things when you look into this. Everyone says, well, where did AA and, where did money and spirituality mix? And history tells us, it's when Ebby put a token, in the subway station to get on the train. It was either the N or the R train in Manhattan and go out to see Bill in Brooklyn. That's where money and spirituality, that's where they mixed, and they mixed in the AA hat. But I think sometimes myself, we get far away from the real meaning of what that money is for and what it's not for. And, in England, I'll give you this. In this country, I used to be the chairman of the finance committee in Chicago. One time we got a check for a little over $50,000 from a woman who died. And her husband had been a member of AA. And he had died early, and she was very thankful for his recovery. So I had to mail that check back. And I had to say thank you to the lawyer, but we don't accept from outside members. If that was an AA member who died, the group conscience for the AA General Service Office in New York City and the group conscience that most intergroups follow across the country, no matter who you are, no matter how rich or poor you are as an AA member, if you die, they will only take $2,000 from you at GSO. And You cannot set up some kind of crazy, revolving, manipulative around, we always have a way around things as alcoholics. I'll just set up a trust for 100 years, Can't do it. The rule is very simple. $2,000 a year each AA member can donate annually. And if you pass away, a maximum you can donate is $2,000. It's to keep the playing field level. We have all walks of life in AA. We would never want anyone to get any more a foothold of feeling more in control of AA and less in control. In England, I just throw this out as an aside, in England for a long time, it was against the law for a nonprofit not to accept money donated to it. And the House of Commons and House of Lords passed the AA exception. The AA General Service Office in Great Britain asked whatever their internal tax code is over there if they could have an exception, if they could not accept money, and they have it. That's how far they've taken that tradition, which to me speaks very heavily of how sacred we treat that. Now, I'll tell you when I learned about the seventh tradition, twice. Both horrible stories of my AA history. The first is when I was the alternate GSR to the West Side Young People's Group in New York City. We were broker than broke. I mean broke. However, we were going to throw a dance to bail us out. And I remember I called my friend Jimmy D at the time, and I said, Jimmy, we're going to have a dance to get the group out of hock. And he said, that's a great idea, but are you only taking money from group members? He was very militant, I would say, on that each group is self-supporting. Not get everybody else in AA to keep your group going. His opinion was, and he was very, I would say, hard about it, was, Billy, if your group can't keep itself going passing the basket, your group may need to fold. And that sounded harsh to me at the time. But I've really grown to embrace that principle. Another time, I was on the International Conference of Young People in AA Committee in 1992 and 93, and we had a lot of money. We had like 4,000 people who were coming to the event that pre-registered, and since it was in Times Square at the Marriott, we decided we needed a $6,000 neon light that would say 36th Ikipa, and would be like in the ballroom and at the dances, and I mean, I thought it sounded like an attractive idea to me at the time. It sounded like, doesn't every AA group that has a big convention in Times Square need its own neon sign? And that same guy, Jimmy D, who I talked about, he was the area delegate at the time. And if you don't know what an area delegate is, I'd be glad to tell you afterwards. But anyway, I had heard that he kept an eye on our local Young People's Committee, that he was kind of sending spies to our committee meeting, that he was afraid we were going to ruin AA's reputation and stuff like that. But what was funny is after we decided to buy the $6,000 neon light, he showed up at the meeting the next time. And it was the best AA service line learning experience in the best way possible that I wish I could be as good at as he is still today. Because he didn't show up and stuff a service manual down our throat or yell at us. He showed up and he simply explained how many softcover big books we could purchase and send into a correctional facility for that $6,000. He showed up and he knew what the phone bill and the electric bill were the last month at New York Intergroup. And he explained, do you know how many months that would keep the lights on at New York Intergroup? And how many months that would keep the phones going? See, I never realized how much the seventh tradition had to do with that, and I think that's where we sometimes fall short in our meetings, myself included. We do a great job with newcomers in AA meetings. If a newcomer walked in here tonight, I'm confident that there's enough people here that that once the newcomer gets into AA, they'll be okay. But what I really needed to learn about the seventh tradition is that without the service structure, the intergroup office, the general service office, people wouldn't know where to go. You can't call the average local AA group. So what happens when there's no money to keep that going? AA's livelihood depends upon newcomers coming through those doors. And the bottom line is, over 90% of those newcomers come through those doors either from calling a hotline, an intergroup, or from a correctional or treatment facility committee referral, which all has to do with AA service. And I just give this little example of, if the average group of 20 people in 1965 collected $20 and could buy coffee and could buy some literature, how can that same group in 2003 survive on that same $20? How can they afford to pay today's coffee prices, pay rent, keep literature on the table for the newcomer, and, I hear people say, we don't want to give money to politics. We don't want to, well, I've been at a lot of committee meetings, and I'll give the same example as last Thursday night. When the Jets or the Yankees are on, it doesn't feel like politics. It feels like commitment. When I'm at a committee meeting, it feels a lot like I'd rather be someplace else sometimes. But my commitment to AA, and I like to talk about that in terms of we need to keep those lights on. We need to keep those phone, I travel a lot for work. AA's name doesn't appear by magic in the phone directory. I forget how much gratitude I should have that there's some local AA intergroup committee that has a phone registered. And I can call and find a meeting. But if I'm grateful for them, I have to be grateful for the groups that are sending in money to keep that entity running. And so I've been taught to be very cognizant of that without those entities running, our newcomers would not know where to go. Any questions on the seventh tradition? Or yes?
So there's a study guide for the big book, and I'm sorry.
It's okay. Go ahead.
And I was told that wasn't AA literature. So doesn't that people who buy that book, doesn't that hurt the area because now people are buying another type of big book, and that's depriving, the service structure there?
I could probably give a 3-hour talk on the big book, the loss of the copyright of the first edition. So I want to stay away from the right as to whether someone has the right to publish that book, because legally in this country they do. My judgment of them as an AA member and whether anyone should be publishing that book and making money is my own opinion. I would treat that book like I treat any other book. It doesn't belong on the AA literature table because it's not AA literature. But I've often thrown this out, too, and I've been thinking about it. The real little blue big book came out because someone else made a really small red one. So AA said, well, maybe if the study guide is so good and people like it, why not write a letter to your local area delegate and say, hey, can you ask GSO to make this? I like the page that's blank where I can write in notes. Well, that's your right as an AA member. Well, why not ask GSO to make one? Where I do find fault, I don't want to say fault's a bad word. Here's where I think you have to watch. You can't claim to be AA, but then when it's convenient, not be AA. I certain times see certain AA conventions or events that are held where the whole weekend they say, we're not AA, this is some kind of study, but then I see it listed in box 459, which only lists AA-related events. So I say, well, you got to pick which you are, and either isn't wrong, it's fine. But I would suggest to people that buy that book to ask yourself this question, which is the question I was told to ask myself. When I buy AA-approved literature, I know where that money is going. I know that there are only 93 struggling AA groups in all of Moscow, and it has almost twice the population of New York City, and New York City has 2,000 groups, and GSO helps send literature over there. I ask, where is the money going that's buying those non-AA books? Is it going into correctional facilities? Is it helping carry the message? Is it going into treatment centers? But that's a personal question I ask myself. Any other questions on Tradition 7? Yes? Okay. I knew tonight would be a question night.
Hey, Billy.
Hi, Vinny.
I got a question only because you mentioned Rockefeller. Something that and I'm a big believer in the seventh tradition. I believe in everything you just said. But the thing that you left out was the fact that Rockefeller did give Bill Wilson $5,000. And we eventually paid that back. What are your beliefs on that $5,000 that was handed? It wasn't the loan that was originally talked about, and the investors weren't investing, but then Rockefeller said, here's $5,000 to get started.
I mean, I know this. What's today's date? It's October 23rd, 2003, and by the grace of God, Alcoholics Anonymous existed today, and it did on January 5th, 1990. And if not, I wouldn't be this lucky as I am today. So a lot of mistakes were made early on. I'm not painting that as one of them. I know that if you read Rockefeller's speech that night, you will see where we got our preamble from. Everyone says, where'd the preamble come from? Take a good hard look at his actual speech that night, and line by line of our preamble, you will see that we almost stole from that speech. That he was the one who said we are not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, or organization. A lot of things that he said that night, not in his exact words, but made its way in our preamble. And, somehow or another, I think the same way as the Jack Alexander article that I mentioned last week. Jack Alexander's job was to expose cults and people that took advantage of people. He didn't have a good reason to write a story about AA. He went in to investigate that story, and as a result, he realized how great AA was. And as a result, we got the biggest influx of people we ever had in our history. So that $5,000, I wasn't there. I don't know. I know we paid it back. So I don't think we would do it today, I can safely say. But that's why I said last week, the traditions are mostly the 12 biggest mistakes AA made in its first 15 years. That would be an easy name for them if we wanted to call them that. So that would be my answer. Great question, though. Any other seventh tradition questions? I knew tonight's traditions would be the ones that everyone just loves. Tradition 8, Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. Special workers is a term for an AA member who gets paid a salary. That's an easy way to look at it. Certain intergroups have special workers. Certain general service office has a general manager who's a special worker, and then 11 AA staff people. You have to be an AA member to get one of those jobs. The general service office also has 83 employees. It doesn't matter whether you're an alcoholic or not, you could apply for that job. Being an alcoholic isn't a requirement for that job. You're not a special worker. But one of the things I think we have to keep in mind about special workers is that they don't do 12-step work. There's a big dividing line with special workers. A special worker's job is to facilitate 12-step work. Never do it while being paid. You know, in the Chicago central office, a special worker will never answer the hotline. A volunteer always does, because they consider that 12-step work. A special worker's job is to make sure that you, as an AA member, have the stuff you need to carry out 12-step work. And I'll say this, the General Service Office every Friday has an 11 o'clock meeting at 119th and Riverside Drive. The AA archives are there, and you can also take a tour of the building. And any of these stories that you hear in AA about what goes on there, and New York has all this money, and go to the 11 o'clock Friday meeting. If you're too scared to go there alone, call me, and I'd be glad to meet you there. Go on the tour. Go from room to room. Stop in the corrections desk, the AA member who gets 300 letters a week from AA members in prison looking for pen pals. Go over to the Loners International desk with the person who gets letters from people who are missionaries in the Peace Corps, on Navy ships, in the Army, and hear about what they're doing in their daily day before you make a rash judgment that we have too much of a central structure. And go to the archives. It's a great experience. We couldn't have gotten this big without a general service office. A lot of us wouldn't be sitting here today if the AA message, we publish our own literature, and we pay alcoholics at a fair rate. I've had the privilege, I always say this about AA service. There are certain positions I've held where, how would you describe it? I wouldn't trade the experience away for $1 million, but I wouldn't do it again for 2. How's that sum it all up? I stole that from a trustee, Father Peter W., who served as one of our trustees from Toronto. I used to love when I'd get complaint phone calls about the Chicago Central office, and they'd say, "How much are we paying so-and-so? Isn't he an alcoholic?" Well, special workers, if you read the traditions and you read the service manual, we pay our people at a fair rate. We pay them what somebody doing that would have gotten paid outside of AA. It's the only way we can really keep a clear line of who's a special worker and who's not. And that's really the bottom line on special workers. I don't want to spend a lot of time there. It's really very clear. We're not in the professional counseling business. We're not in the therapy business, and we don't get paid for our 12-step work. You know, it's the old saying, you got to give it away for free to keep it. That's very separate from writing letters to keep AA going. Any questions about that, or? Yes, Kay?
Hi. So what's your feeling about AA members who work in rehab to get paid to work with alcoholics?
Well, I think the traditions tell me clearly that my job is to cooperate, not criticize, number one. So what they do for a living would be like you asking me, what's your opinion of you working for a construction company? I don't think an AA member has a right. It's not an AA-related question. That's my opinion. However, I'll go a little bit down the path since you opened up the door. I'll open it up a little further. I think it's dangerous when someone who is paid in that profession, and I have all the respect in the world, when they come into an AA setting and expect to be treated like they know any more or less than any other person who's just an AA member. I mean, this is the great equalizer, this room. Doesn't matter what you do for a living. You come into this room, our book tells us we're uniquely qualified. Not because of a degree, not because of a certificate, but because we suffer from the same spiritual malady and we have the same way out. So I caution people. I think sometimes I worry about people sometimes who get in that profession. As a person, I worry about them, but not from an AA point of view. That, you know, how hard it is. There's some people I really respect in that profession, and they tell me that that in order to be successful, they have to make sure that they know when to wear each hat. They're either in their work hat or their AA member hat. You can never have the two on at the same time. That's what the traditions tell you. So that would be my answer. Mike? Just kidding. Any other questions on that? Okay. Tradition 9, which I love, AA is such it will never be organized, but where we create special boards of committees directly responsible to those they serve. When you look at the front of it, I just want to tell you, when we talk about the steps, we always talk about commas, hyphens, underlines, you know. Pay attention to them with the traditions. That comma, AA as such, Alcoholics Anonymous as such. That means AA, the spiritual entity. AA has another side, though. To operate in this world of the modern world, we need to have a corporate structure, unfortunately, to fit in with today's society. You can't have 83 employees and not be a nonprofit organization. You can't have 83 employees and not be a boss, especially if there's just one alcoholic working there. You would never get anything done. Never mind a couple, you know. But I like where the tradition really goes on for the group. To me, the two most important things it says are, rotating leadership is the best. That's period. Rotating leadership is the best. And then it says, you know, directly responsible to those they serve. And that's why, Casey, I'm just going to point you out for a second. You asked the steering committee question last week. When I talk about steering committees, are they directly responsible to those they serve? In other words, does a whole group elect those members and say, we want you to run our group for a year? Or is it some self-appointed, anointed, passed down the sponsorship line steering committee? Then I would say, according to fit into the tradition, Any AA body should be directly responsible to those they serve. And if there's not anyone you're accountable to, well, then how accountable are you going to be, is my experience in AA. Rotating leadership, I think it's very hard in Alcoholics Anonymous. I think today, 4 years later, I could be a much better delegate to the General Service Conference than I actually was. However, I can never do that again as per the service manual. But what I've learned about AA service is, just when you think you've really grasped the hold of a job, it's time to give it up. That's what I've learned about AA service. Just when you think you really got being the cookie person down, I go down to that level or up to that level because I think it speaks a lot about us as a whole. Myself especially, the ego and the arrogance that runs in our head sometimes is amazing than to the average individual. And so it doesn't matter if I'm the president of a AA club's board of directors or a coffee maker. I usually have that much pride in whatever I'm doing. So when it's my first week after being coffee maker and I come back and it's someone else, they don't do it as good as me. They didn't have it set out right. They didn't buy the right cookies. But I know that I'll always be worried about that. Now, the other thing about rotating leadership that I've learned is this. When you don't rotate or you don't have rotation, I think it breeds something. And this is from my experience. I think, myself included, especially included, but I've met a lot of people in AA, is that we get very scared that somebody could do the job after us and perhaps do a better job. I think it's a natural tendency that a lot of human beings have. I don't care if it's in AA or out of AA. Oh my God, they're going to elect a new person and that person's going to do a better job than me and everyone's going to know. But I think rotating leadership is there for a reason. It's really to make sure that no one or no group or no clique ever runs from the smallest AA group to the largest AA service organization. And I think it's one of those things that's not unclear or ambiguous. I mean, rotating leadership is the best, period. If you can find a little way around that gives any wiggle room that there's another possible way that's just as good, I'd be willing to listen to it. But even a guy like me who loves to find angles and shoot corners hasn't found a way around that one. Any questions about that or about that tradition? No questions? Okay. Tradition 10, if anyone has their book with them, I want to urge you to go to the long form. Alcoholics has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name would never be drawn into public controversy. The long form will tell you that not only Alcoholics Anonymous, but it goes on to say any AA group or AA member. So I'll tell you my interpretation of that. Is that when I'm in a setting where I'm an AA member, like right now at this podium, especially when you're at a podium, I think a little bit more of responsibility falls upon yourself. The AA podium should never be used. I remember one time I was in a meeting, and I was recently in a meeting where an election came up, like outside in public, and how much money would go to treatment centers. And I wonder whether that really has any business in an AA meeting. And I really wonder as an AA member if I have any business even talking about that in an AA meeting. When it says that we may never endorse, I'm just going to throw this out. I'm not going to tell you it's my opinion or anything else. But in certain parts of the country, you will notice that the Serenity Prayer has really, really exploded around the Our Father. And so you have these divisions that grow up in AA, We've always done the Our Father. We're doing that to the end of time. And then you have this other division, like if you go into Manhattan, I've heard meetings there closed with wicker prayers, earth prayers, poems, anything but the Our Father. Is that there are some people in AA who feel that for the newcomer who walks in the door, seeing a bunch of people saying the Our Father looks very Christian. I'm not saying it does or it doesn't. I think the traditions ask us or help us ask ourselves healthy questions. I think what's very interesting is in the long form, it says specifically, when it talks about outside controversial issues, it then defines the ones that we should be specifically worried about. It says politics, alcohol reform, or sectarian religion. It specifically mentions those three, which I think if you read our history is not by mistake. I think they are warning us big time, throwing a big red flag in the air, that those three could be the possibly three most dangerous outside topics in an AA meeting. And so I often give this example that when I am at a podium, my personal God, I'm not sure how much I really need to talk about it. If I'm talking in the context of the steps and a member of a group, I may go a little further. But I have to be very cognizant of a newcomer and what they might think somebody at the podium is talking about and whether that is AA or isn't AA. Because I always go back to that. It's just the way I've been taught. I'm responsible for the newest person in the room to get AA. And I have to understand that in their head they know nothing about AA. And I need to realize that up front. We've been dragged into a few bad issues, and I think I've heard people say, when I served at GSO at the General Service Conference, I had the privilege of being on the Public Information Committee, and I always hear people say, why doesn't AA respond to that stuff? You know, why doesn't AA write press releases and respond back? We've never, and I don't think we ever will. And I think it drives certain media people crazy. They up the ante and write something else or put a little bit more dramatic on TV about AA, and we still don't respond. Somebody writes a newspaper article, we just don't respond. There was a show on 2020 about moderation management. We didn't respond. They put down AA. We didn't respond. We've always just taken the high road. And I think it speaks a lot about our organization as a whole and the character of this organization we call Alcoholics Anonymous, that we never lower ourselves to get in those kind of public debates, that our only job is to be here for the still sick and suffering alcoholic should they decide they need AA. And so we don't respond to those things. And sometimes AA members get mad because they take it personal. I've read some of those letters. AA saved my life. So people feel very passionate about it. So when they see someone trashing the organization that saved their life, they want to know why we're not fighting back. But we've found the best ammunition is to hold ourselves up to a standard that nobody else does. Any questions about that? Yes, right in the front row.
Hi. Is it because of that tradition that we compromised our circle and triangle? And also, I just wanted to wait and get two questions in at once. On Tradition 8, or Tradition 9, rather, the service boards or committees, does intergroup fall under that as a special service board or committee? And in such, is intergroup actually part of AA, or is that a special entity?
I would answer yes to both those last two questions. Intergroup's definitely part of AA, because when you want to call AA and go to an AA meeting, you call intergroup. I mean, I would say intergroup's definitely part of AA. The other part of that, the circle and triangle question? Oh, no, you had another question besides it. Oh, are they a special? Yes. I consider them a committee as outlined in that tradition. The circle and triangle, that's another 3-hour dialogue. However, I'll give you the real short answer is that that was a trademark, not a copyright. And so the problem was we could never enforce it because it was all our own people who were breaking it. I mean, that's really what it came down to. I love the circle and triangle, and like many people I'm sure in this room, when you get a sponsor who gets a new big book that doesn't have it in it, you make them draw it in it like it used to be in there. I love that symbol, and I love the three sides. The problem was, if you went to an AA convention It was all our own members who were wearing it on their shirt, their hat, their keychain, their anything. I mean, it was all our own members. It wasn't like somebody outside the fellowship wasn't observing the circle and triangle. It was our own members. And as such, we really didn't have a leg to stand on because it would have looked selective. It would have been the General Service Office really owned that trademark in a loose sense of the word. So what? They're going to go after everybody that's not AA, but the millions of members of AA who don't have permission to wear that trademark, they're going to leave them alone. Well, we've never operated like that. We've always operated to a much higher standard. So I don't think that issue is closed forever, and I think in my lifetime it'll come back up to the level of the General Service Conference. Any other questions about Tradition 10? 11, I just want to point out, our public relations policy, attraction rather than promotion. In the long form, it talks about sensational advertising, and I think that that's an important thing to take a look at. It says we avoid sensational advertising. A billboard that says if you have a drinking problem, call AA, they've been around for years. I've been part of committees that get letters and say that's a violation. Or, I don't know if anyone here has ever seen a public service announcement on TV late at night. AA makes and produces public service announcements. But the difference between our announcements and our billboards and everyone else's is sensational. I ask you all, the next time you look at a rehab commercial late at night on TV, you will usually see something sensational. You will see the line or the bottles or the, just something, even a billboard that has like a crashed car. We're not in that business. We don't go that route. Our public service announcements and our billboards are very, very, just laid back, easy to read, and let you know if you have an AA problem. I mean, many church bulletins across the country and newspapers publish that little blurb. I think it says, if drinking is your problem, if drinking is your problem, not drinking is our business. I think AA had an advertisement like that for years. That's not really sensational advertising. And I also want to say this. Sometimes I'll be in an AA group and I'll hear, well, that's promotion about maybe the grapevine or something else. Promotion is for outside the fellowship, not inside. We should be promoting AA and AA literature as much as possible. That tradition really applies to the outside. I even hear sometimes people say, well, that group promotes the big book too much. Well, how is that possible? I mean, I ask myself that question sometimes, but the bottom line is we're not worried about promotion inside AA. We're worried about outside. We're worried about, it drives certain AA members crazy again because just think back, maybe you're in that stage now, but when you really loved AA, when it finally clicked in your head that this is the best thing that ever happened to you, and you wanted everyone else to know about it, and you wanted to save the world, and that we don't do. We're not in the saving the world business. We're in the saving a sick, suffering alcoholic, one at a time, a day at a time business. And so we kind of keep ourselves away from that kind of big public advertising. But there are some people, and I just want to honor their belief, that believe that even we shouldn't make public service announcements, that we shouldn't be in that business. I find most of the AA public service announcements made in good taste, without a lot of sensationalism, no sensationalism. And I just want to add quickly that personal anonymity. I said tonight my name was Billy, I was an alcoholic for a reason. Because the GSO guidelines tell me that if a meeting is being taped, if I use my last name, it's an anonymity break. Especially if that tape is sold at an AA convention or conference where somebody from Al-Anon or, we don't check ID cards when we sell tapes. So the GSO guideline is clear. Now, if you know someone who happens not to do that, great for them. And I'm not saying they're wrong. I know what the GSO guideline says, which is the group conscience of AA, what the delegates voted on at some year, not to use your last name if you're being taped. And sometimes I slip up and do, but I try to stay away from it. Also, personal anonymity, I think we just have to remember that it's really to make sure that AA's reputation is based on AA, not on one person. You know, I remember one time the corrections committee wanted to write a referral letter for somebody who wasn't approved for their background clearance, until an old-timer said, what happens if that person drinks in 10 years and does something wrong? You want that recommendation on AA letterhead floating out there? We don't do those things. We're not in the recommendation business. If you as an AA member want to write a letter for your sponsee, that's great. But you don't put the Serenity Porch of AA official group logo at the top of your paper. You know, you don't make it look like this AA group is saying this person. No, you're saying as your own AA member. You're saying as yourself, your experience with this person. And, you know, we don't put our names in the paper. We don't put pictures in the paper. We put last names. And just so you know, it's not, we can't educate the press. We try to every year. We send, AA once a year sends a letter out to all the press outlets, but we have to properly teach our sponsees, you know. If you're interviewed, if you know, at AA conventions, sometimes there'll be a reporter there. It can properly be done. It can be done within the traditions. It's just we don't use our last names and we don't use our pictures. And we don't base AA's reputation on any one member. Unfortunately, I see AA's members always break their anonymity when they get caught, like, with a gun in their seat, under their seat, you know. Then all of a sudden, I was going to AA, I'm going back to AA. You know, it's never when life is going good do you hear someone break their AA anonymity usually. It's usually when there's some kind of sensational article, and that's unfortunate. It's also the reason we have the tradition. And I'll end by this saying, there's a lot of great grapevine articles about the tragedies of breaking your anonymity and the horrible things, people who've taken their own lives. They couldn't imagine coming back because they told the whole world they were sober. So I would encourage you to read about that. You know, personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and film has been an important part of our... Bill W. was the biggest breaker of anonymity that probably AA ever had for the first 10 or 15 years. He also is the only man in the history of the world that we know of who's refused to be the Time Man of the Year. Obviously, he learned a hard lesson. You don't go from allowing your picture to be in every newspaper in the country and then having both the Nobel Peace Prize and Time Magazine and things like that offered to you, and you turn around and say, you know, Bill told Time Magazine, if you want to write a story about AA, that's great. Don't write a story about me. I even think Time Magazine just published a special thing about the 80 greatest days in the history of the world. And if you go to the 1930s, if you go to June 10th, 1935, you will see the founding of AA, which I think is incredible. But Bill made sure that even when Time did it years ago, that it was about AA, not him. So obviously he didn't just learn that overnight. I think if you read Bill's history, you'll see the man suffered some tough personal years when all of AA's reputation rested on him and when he was the end-all, be-all, and how good his life really became when he gave AA back to the groups. The 12th tradition, anonymity being the spiritual foundation, I already went into it. Principles before personalities, we could do a 3-year topic conversation on. However, I think I'll go back to the exit sign. If you leave here after a business meeting and you call on your sponsees to make sure they're at the next business meeting to change a vote, that's not principles before personality. And it's definitely not the spiritual foundation that our traditions were rested on. And also, your personal anonymity, your membership as an AA member, or I'll say mine, the 12 and 12 and a lot of other books tell me I am so much more unimportant than the organization of Alcoholics Anonymous. AA can survive without Billy. It really can't be said any clearer. I mean, that's, when you boil it all down, I'm nothing without AA. And AA will operate just as good tomorrow if I decide to leave. And that, I think, is the great leveling point of the 12th tradition. Personal anonymity means, you know, we protect your anonymity. We honor your anonymity. But if you say you're going to leave AA will be fine. And it depends upon it in the first tradition that AA be here for those who aren't here yet. Any questions about the 11th to 12th tradition? And I think we could end the tape if we have to, because I know we'll just go to questions if that's all right.